For those of you who are just starting to listen in, um, this is your video for if you did not attend class on the past March 10th theory lesson. So, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to listen to a bit of the Sarabande by Handel. This is an example of a classical Baroque piece of music. So, this is the perfect introduction to what Baroque music sounds like. Now, my question for you to think about as you're listening is, does this music sound fancy or does it not? And why? And if you're writing in the comment section, this might be a good thing for you to comment on. Here we go. All right, so next we're going to look at these musical pieces in history. Or, I'm sorry, musical periods in history. So we're starting here with the medieval period, which starts in the year 800 and goes until 1450. Now, the medieval period is not when music was invented. There's been music as long as there's been people. But the medieval period is the first time where someone tried to write music down. And so we had our written art form as well as our oral art form. After the medieval period came the Renaissance period, and that's when our music started to get a bit more flourishy. In the medieval period, it was very, very standard, very, very solo voice. So you could have more than one person, but everybody would be singing the same pitches at the same time. The technical term for that is monophony. Mono meaning one, but that doesn't mean it's a soloist. It just means that everybody is singing one voice together. So in the Renaissance period, we started to discover polyphony, which is poly, multiple voices together, which again means there's multiple people singing, but now they're not all following the same melody, but they're starting to have other melodies playing at the same time. So after the Renaissance period in 1600, we have the Baroque period. Now, the Baroque period is the time period that we are focusing on currently. And the major point that I'd like for you to take away about the Baroque period is that it is very, very fancy. And what that means is that the Baroque period utilizes different techniques in order to make their music sound even more flourishy than the Renaissance period. That means they're putting in lots of different ornaments to decorate their music. Ornaments in the Baroque period include the trill, the turn, and the appoggiatura. We will be learning about these three things later on. We will also, in the next couple of weeks, be taking a look at the classical period, the Romantic period, and the Impressionist period. These all have major differences, which is why they are separated from each other. And then finally, we see there is the modern period, which goes from 1910 to present, 2021. The only three of these periods that went more than 100 years, more than a century, are the Baroque period, the Renaissance period, and the modern period. Everything else was less than 100 years. All right, next we're going to watch a video that tells us a little bit more about the Baroque period and what exactly makes it.
During the Renaissance period, Leonardo da Vinci painted Mir, the Mona Lisa. Music was played by troubadours with lutes. Singers performed madrigals. Michelangelo was creating his masterpieces. Inventions included the printing press, eyeglasses, and gunpowder.
But during the 17th century, music began to change. People began to dress differently. String instruments were grouped together in what were called orchestras. The harpsichord was added to almost every piece of music, and it sounded like this. Thank you. This was a time of fancy music, fancy buildings,
fancy hair, fancy pants, fancy dogs.
Well, not quite fancy dogs, but fancy everything else. Welcome to the Baroque period. The Baroque period. I'm so excited, I'm joined by Madame Elizabeth. We shall do a Baroque greeting. Yeah, very fancy. Now, in the Baroque period, they would fancy everything up a bit. They even fancied up music, and they did it by adding trills. What is a trill? I hear you cry. A trill is a fast wobble shared with the note above it. I'll show you. Very fancy, a trill. Another thing they used to add to their music was the turn. The turn is a bit like a wave of the ocean. It goes along, up, below, and back to the same note. Listen to this. turn. Again, very fancy. And then they added appoggiaturas. Appoggiatura. Now, an appoggiatura is a note, a little note, before the main note that you want to sing. And that makes it fancy again. Listen to this. So a trill, a turn, and an appoggiatura. Now we're going to add those three fancy Baroque bits to a famous tune, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Off we go.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
Very fancy.
If the Baroque period was a cake, it would be fancy. A fancy Baroque cake, 1600 to 1750.
Get in! Look at that! The Baroque period, 400 years ago, 1600 to 1750. Look on there. That is Vivaldi. He was one of the greatest composers of the Baroque period.
That is my music. Don't we know it?
He loved to include trills, turns, and appoggiaturas in his music. Hang on a minute. I wonder what it was like to live 400 years ago.
In the beginning of the Baroque period, William Shakespeare was writing plays in England. And Louis XIV was the fanciest and most famous king of France to ever live. He owned 1,000 wigs. But he only wore them one at a time. There were no dentists. If you had a bad tooth, the barber pulled it. After he cut your hair. There were no forks. There was no electricity. Everything was done by candlelight, which means there was no TV. Hey! What's the big deal?
So we've got Shakespeare, fancy buildings, fancy this, fancy that. The Baroque period, quick! To the phone box! Hang on, what are you doing here?
I can't get back to the Baroque period. I'm stuck in a time warp.
Right, stay here, I'll be back.
No, I'm coming with you.
Come on! Nine! This way! So, in the Baroque period, they used the harpsichord.
Yes, the harpsichord. The strings are plucked by a piece of goose feather. Here, take a look.
Right, so when I hit a key, the goose feather plucks the string. Cool.
I cut the pluckers for my dad. When a piece of music is being played, the bass notes are played by a... Look, here's one.
Yeah, the cello. Right, you play the bass notes, I'll play the harpsichord. 1, 2.
The cello plays the bass notes, and the harpsichord plays the chords in rhythm.
A bit like the bass and drums in a rock band.
A rock band? What is that, a band of rocks? That's crazy. Wait till I tell my dad.
Who is your dad?
He's Johann as well. Johann Sebastian Bach. You won't have heard of him.
His Bach son.
The most famous composers of Baroque period were Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi. Most of them wrote music for rich kings, princes, or the church. They wrote choir pieces, orchestra pieces, organ pieces, and were prolific, which means they did a lot of music writing. Bach was a master at writing fugues, which are a bit like rounds.
You mean like row, row, row your boat?
Sort of. They were like musical puzzles. You take a little bit of tune. Then you start that tune at a different point in the same piece. He wrote loads. He was fugue mad. Vivaldi wrote the Four Seasons, a fancy Baroque piece that had 4 sections all about the seasons of the year. And Handel wrote a piece called The Messiah. You may have heard it playing in your house when your dad gets a pay raise.
Where did that come from? Thank my lucky stars! Woohoo!
Handel, Vivaldi, or Bach, Johann's dad, was some of the greatest Baroque composers. In fact, in the Baroque period, the orchestra was just starting. There was only 3 violins, 3 violas, which were a bit bigger and lower pitched than violins, 3 cellos, 2 double basses.
Ready?
A harpsichord, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 1 bassoon, a timpani player who didn't really do very much, and that's about it.
My dad adds a trumpet and a horn sometimes, too.
And clarinets came along a bit later in the Baroque period. Now today, we've added a few more players.
No one sits on chairs either, but the harpsichord does stay in the middle.
Wow. Sorry. Now, also, in the Baroque period, there were no women in the orchestra either. But for now, we'll keep it as it is.
My dad wrote this piece. It's called Air on a G String.
Great. Well, seeing as your dad wrote it, why don't you conduct it?
Conducting? What is that? The person on the harpsichord is the leader.
I guess that's me. Okay, let's hit it. Air on a G string by Bach. Here we go. Hear how the harpsichord plays the chords and the rhythm, and the cello or bass plays the steady bass part. That's a great way to recognise Baroque period music. Listen.